excited. We've lots to talk about today. Welcome, everybody. It's so lovely to see you all here. Welcome to this month's Digi event. It's our series of online talks hosted by RSVP, includes also workshops and roundtables, and it's topics of interest to our members, but everybody is, of course, most welcome. I'm Alison Chapman. I'm Professor of English at the University of Victoria in BC, Canada, and I'm also Vice President of RSVP. And one of the pleasures of my roles is organising Digi events along with a fantastic committee, and everybody from the committee is here, so thank you guys. I am also delighted today that Claire Horrocks, an old friend of RSVP and also from the Liverpool John Moores University, is chairing our event today. This is a talk based on the expansion of the Curran Index by its current editors, Emily Middleton and Lars Atkin. And the Curran Index, as I'm sure all of you know, is RSVP's flagship open access collaborative research database based on uncovering anonymous contributors to the periodical press. This is an incredible resource made possible by the generous bequest of Eileen Curran, after who, of course, it's named. And I also want to recognise the first Curran Index database editor, Gary Simons, as well as its longtime champion, Patrick Leary. And Patrick, I'm especially happy that you're here today. Thank you. So Claire will, of course, properly introduce this event in a moment, but I just wanted to take a moment to celebrate the current editors of the Curran, Emily and Lars, because they're retiring from their position. They've had a 5-year term, and they're retiring as editors of the Curran Index at the end of December. And we're currently involved in finding new editors of the Curran, and there should be an announcement about that at the end of the year. But I wanted this event also to be an opportunity for congratulating Emily and Lars for all they've achieved. We're incredibly proud of what you've done with thank you for the applause, with the Curran Index, not only revamping the back end and the front end to make it massively more user-friendly for us all, but also in massively expanding the Curran Index as well, including more titles and also more exciting contributors, more diverse contributors, and especially, of course, Frances Power Cobbe, who's the subject of the talk today. So thank you so much, Emily, Lars, for everything you've done. I know it's been tough during pandemic years, especially, but we're so delighted by what you've achieved with the Curran Index. It's a wonderful legacy that you're leaving, and it will ensure, I think, the success of periodical research going forward too for RSVP. So thank you so very much. Thank you. And now over to Claire.
That's lovely. Thanks ever so much, Alison. I'm really glad to be chairing today's session, not least because I've benefited from the sort of wonderful editorial work of Emily and Lars with my punch attribution data, which was started with Patrick and Gary, and which was sort of brought to full culmination under Emily and Lars. So a thank you from me as well. So the talk today is going to be thinking about the wider contribution that the Curran Index makes to bringing journalists and writers out of the shadows, and we'll focus particularly today on data gleaned from an archive of more than 1,000 articles contained in the scrapbooks of the journalist, freethinker and antivivisectionist Frances Power Cobbe. The data includes several hundred leader articles for the Liverpool Echo. So using topic modelling and statistical analysis, the talk today is going to consider Cobbe's position in relation to other journalists of the era, and we'll be finishing the session by thinking about the wider significance of attribution scholarship and where that may be taking us over the sort of coming years. And we started with a really interesting discussion in the sort of breakout room while we were waiting to come in. So lots of great things come in. So I'll hand over to Emily, who's going to be talking on behalf of Lars as a team today.
Thank you so much for a lovely introduction, and it's been a real pleasure to be involved with the Curran Index in this part of its history. So Lars is not able to join us today. That might mean the talk is slightly truncated, but there's also so many things to say that it might not be, so we'll see how we get on. I'm going to share my screen. I have a few slides that I think help with this sense of, as is in the title, archival plenitude and some of the difficulties of working with so much material. That also means when it comes to Frances Power Cobbe, there's more that I would like to do, that the volume of it has meant that we've not quite got there yet. So In this session, I'm going to discuss how the addition of dailies to the Curran Index might afford new research opportunities and challenges using Frances Power Cobbe as a case study. The plenitude of the 19th century newspaper archive challenges our principles of selection while providing opportunities to widen our understanding of the 19th century field by continuing to bring out of the shadows journalists whose contribution has long been masked by the shadow of anonymity. And Cobbe is an interesting figure in that sense because it's not really that her contribution has been lost, but I think with what we've known already, it's just been massively understated or not very easy to get a sense of exactly how much she was contributing and what it was. So, as Claire said, there's around 1,000 articles and attributions that we've added to the Curran Index from scrapbooks held by the National Library of Wales relating to Frances Power Cobbe, which have now been integrated. And the largest part of those are leader articles for the Echo. So I'm gonna think about what we might learn from Cobbe, from these new attributions. We hope to learn from Cobbe in time. And some reflections on the position of Cobbe in relation to other journalists in the index and of the period. Did she write on similar topics to her contemporaries, for example? And looking at things like her age and gender in relation to what we have in the index. So the first thing that I'm going to talk about is the move to include dailies and the implications for the Curran Index. The investigators working on the Wellesley Index based their attributions on publishers' and editors' records, apparently authoritative marked files, biographies, and contemporary letters from authors and their literary and social networks. These sources remain the gold standard for attributions, and like its predecessor, the Curran Index has relied on these where possible. However, even with these authoritative gold standard publishers' ledgers, the Curran Index research team ran into substantial difficulties, as Mila Daskalova has documented for the website in writing about her research and transcription of the Chambers Journal Literary Labours Ledger for 1858 to 1864 at the National Library of Scotland. And this is a picture of part of one of the pages of the ledgers that we have scanned, which sort of helps you understand what a huge task Mila took on in trying to decipher hundreds and thousands of attributions like this. After identifying which ledger had contribution information in it, Mila found that the process of transcription and attribution was far from straightforward. Many of the contributors feature in the ledgers only with their surnames, initials, or descriptions, such as R.C.'s friend, so Robert Chambers' friend. Furthermore, the authors of some of the published pieces were unknown to the publishers themselves. The contributors column is occasionally left blank or says anonymous. Even when a full name was provided in the ledgers, finding an exact match in the census records and other databases was not always possible. Many of the recorded attributions therefore need to be confirmed and researched further. So what is clear from this example is that the gold standard sources favoured by the Wellesley Index investigators are far from providing a stable record of contributor information. Attribution scholarship always involves an element of creative detective work, which is the great fun of editing the Curran, I would say. As our predecessor Gary Simons acknowledged, the proliferation of online tools and databases has made the work of cross-referencing attribution data easier than it was in the past. Even a scholar with the prodigious abilities Richard Altick was famous for possessing to scan through thousands of periodical pages at pace would struggle to compete with the depth and pace of the British Newspaper Archive search tool. Meanwhile, the publication online of census data can make it easier to identify contributors, providing location details are also added. Although, having said that, the John Smith from London that we found in the Chambers ledger is unlikely to be properly identified. The attribution can be slippery was acknowledged by the Wellesley investigators, which is why, as well as having definite attributions, what in the Curran Index hierarchy we call high confidence attributions, they also made the decision to publish attributions which had been gained by internal evidence, such as relations between articles, expressed opinions, and so on. And they're marked in Wellesley as probable, which means 50 to 90% certainty, while possible indicates a lower likelihood. In recent years, the Curran Index team has moved to a more collaborative approach to attribution scholarship. This was one of the main goals of our editorship, myself and Lars. We began by widening our net of potential collaborators, hiring paid research assistants, as well as doing regular calls for contributions at RSVP events and in the monthly newsletter. And through this process, we've come to a new model for gaining attributions, which relies less on large-scale projects focused on complete attributions for a particular periodical within a particular time frame, as with the Chambers material we have, or the huge Athenaeum review project, or the also enormous Punch project, but which aims to make the current index a repository for attributions discovered by scholars across the multidisciplinary fields of 19th century literature, history, and journalism studies. And this has led to two key shifts in the focus of our investigations. Firstly, we've expanded beyond weekly and monthly periodicals, which was the mainstay of the current index beforehand, and have begun to gain some attributions from dailies such as the Echo and even the Times, as well as having some plans to include more literary annuals. So kind of stretching both ends of the scale. Of course, newspaper archives pose new and specific challenges. As Matt Stevens' research has demonstrated, newspapers were even more volatile than periodicals. The vulnerability of dailies, not just to macroeconomic shifts, but also to the changing fortunes of their proprietors, means that many newspaper titles were short-lived, and especially in the case of the non-metropolitan press, are often poorly archived. In contrast, when newspapers do have a longue durée, as in the case of the Times or the Manchester Guardian, the challenges of archival plenitude can often make the prospects of approaching an archive daunting. Scoping out a definitive time period to begin to index comes up against the usual problems of periodicity. What do we count as historically important and to whom? And these questions are not ideologically neutral. So we needed a more contained approach to approach. Thank you, Lars. Dailies. And the answer to this problem for us has been to try out a more author-centered rather than publication-centered approach in our methodology. So one of the key goals, as mentioned, that we had when we took over the index was becoming more collaborative. So we started to get submissions from a variety of scholars, some of whom are here today, so thank you very much for those, who are working on particular journalists. And when deciding whether to integrate those into the current index, we maintained the standards of the Wellesley research team by requiring some verification, either from a publisher's ledger or an authoritative biographical source, and things like scholarly research notes for a biography in the case of George Augustus Sala. So cross-referencing these gold standard sources with census records and the B&A enabled us to double-check attributions, while the database we use for the current index includes a notes field that allows us to put in more detailed information about attribution provenance, with the aim that any scholar who so chooses should be able to go back to the archive and look at the source of the attribution themselves. However, there's one area where we've had to depart somewhat from the gold standard of high confidence, with 90% or over probability, and enter into more slippery territory of the probably and the likely. And that is when dealing with scrapbooks. Katie Birch at Aberystwyth had alerted us to the existence in the archives of the National Library of Wales of 4 volumes of scrapbooks belonging to Frances Power Cobbe. And this is what they sort of look like. And earlier this year, Vic Clark, working for us, took on the challenge of the scrapbooks, and I'm going to talk a bit about some of those methodological challenges. So these scrapbooks compiled by Cobbe are really fascinating objects in and of themselves, and they contain cuttings of more than 900 articles published in the Echo, the Standard, and other periodicals and newspapers. However, without always knowing the exact date or publication an article appeared in. This one's nicely laid out. Thank you, Frances. But sometimes it doesn't include which periodical it is. It doesn't have the date information. Vic had to use the British Newspaper Archive to try and cross-reference and find things. The limitations of this became apparent when an article, for example, titled Church and Chapel, yielded 195 possible results, even when constrained to the Echo and the 10-year period in which Cobbe worked for it, sort of 7-year period. Using first lines narrows down the search, but as with these attributions, we're still working on the basis of educated detective work rather than absolute certainty. The Cobbe attributions sometimes then being ranked as low or medium certainty, with low being sort of 50%, medium being sort of 60 to 70%. And I also just wanted to kind of dip away from the Echo, which I'm going to talk about in more detail, to think about scrapbooks as such a fascinating resource in periodical studies, and how I think there's a really interesting piece of work to be done here on Cobbe as a scrapbooker and collector, because we certainly haven't got all of her Echo leaders from this. So she didn't collect everything. There's questions about what she did choose to collect and what she left out. But Vic would also sometimes come to us and say, there's things here that I'm pretty certain she didn't write and that she just liked, that she's just collecting things, sometimes about gardening, that she is interested in, but not really delineating them. So again, it's difficult to know what is necessarily her own work, what is stuff that she has chosen to keep for some reason, and why she's chosen to leave out things which should probably be there. As well as cross-referencing with online databases, tracing republication circuits can be a vital tool in the scholar's toolkit when dealing with newspapers. As Meredith McGill noted, in the American context, the culture of reprinting was central to journalistic practice in the 19th century. While the Viral Text Project brought us the idea of the networked text, texts that become delinked from their authors and take on a life of their own through unattributed reprinting, tracing networks of circulation through reprints can give us valuable insights about the afterlives of literary works, such as poems and short stories. Clearly, Cobbe's scrapbooking process suggests that she intended her political leaders for the Echo to have a cultural afterlife of some kind. Just a year after leaving the paper, she also republished a selection of her leaders in a volume titled Re-Echoes. And I think it's such a wonderful title that plays on this idea of what it is that journalism is doing and what kinds of traces it might leave. Cross-referencing the attributions from the scrapbooks, both with the British Newspaper Archive and Re-Echoes, added a level of extra authority to the attributions we've now included. And now I'm going to talk about what we do actually have, because I think it's very exciting how much we've expanded what we know about Cobbe. But before talking in detail about Cobbe, I want to talk about what the Curran contains so we can think about how typical this data is, but also the ways in which it's pushing us beyond what we have already. So the purpose of the Curran is to enable users to build up a clearer picture of 19th century journalism. Eileen Curran intended for it, when she was still publishing it as corrections to the Wellesley and additions to the Wellesley, to help answer questions about the sociology of authorship. And I quoted this in my RSVP paper because I think it's such a useful quotation for thinking about what attribution research does. And she says, we have no reliable studies of many aspects of 19th century journalism. For example, were the contributors to a particular journal a small and close-knit group of regulars, a larger and only loose-knit group of regulars, a disparate group of occasional contributors? Was there ever a norm? I'm thinking about the relationship between journals, frequency of publication, price, intended audience, and who wrote for it. So in order to think about these questions with the Curran, I'm just going to provide a bit of an overview of some of the kind of quirks of the kind of data that we have in the Curran. So a small number of contributors are rather overrepresented in the Curran. Just realised you probably can't see those numbers on the side. There we go. Percival Lee, very prolific man, clearly, has 14,000 attributions in our kind of 170,000 attribution data set, due to the wonderfully large amount of data from Punch we have and his role as a founding contributor, sorry. His role as a founding contributor. Frances Cowley-Burnand has about 11,000. Tom Taylor, another Punch editor, is in third place. So in order to kind of situate Cobbe, we basically, after we discount Punch and the Athenaeum, Frances Power Cobbe is now the most prolific contributor we have in the index, with about 1,000 articles. In response to Eileen Curran's question about whether contributors were a small group of regulars, from this data set, it would appear that yes, they were. However, 37% of contributors only appear once in the data set. And this may be due to the nature of the Curran as a supplement to Wellesley and its focus on unsigned articles, where, for example, it contains only 5 articles written by Charles Dickens, even though he published possibly hundreds, sometimes signed across his career. We can break this down in other ways, that the mean number of contributions per contributor in the Curran is about 44, while the median number of contributions is 2. So we've got quite a range from these people at the very high end to people who've only written 1 or 2 things. And 649 contributors out of the few thousand we have wrote for more than 1 periodical in our data set. So now let's think about Frances Power Cobbe, who is now the most prolific contributor in the index, not connected to Punch or the Athenaeum, and connected in the index with 27 different periodicals. And these are the biggest ones that we have, and several of these are new to the index. But we also have single contributions from her to the Western Daily Press, the Ecclesiastic and Theologian, the Western Times, Women's Suffrage Journal, Castle's Magazine, Globe, Cambrian News, and so on. So, of the articles we have for Cobb, over 500 are leaders for the Echo, published on page 1 of the Echo. And to put that in context of what we already had before, we had in her republished selection 51 and an additional 40 from Sally Mitchell. So we've gone from knowing and attributing about 91 leaders to Frances Power Cobbe to over 500. So this is an absolutely huge expansion of what we know that she wrote for the Echo. And this is the real research opportunity that this data set presents. Cobbe claimed to have written over 1,000 articles for the Echo. She contributed leaders 3 times a week from the founding of the journal in 1868 up to 1875, when the journal, when she stopped writing for them, essentially. Established by the publishing company of Cassel, Peter and Galpin, the Echo took advantage of stamp duty repeal to become London's first halfpenny daily evening paper, publishing in 8 pages in 3 editions every day except for Sunday. And it appealed especially to commuters, such as city clerks, civil servants, and artisans, and gained a circulation quite quickly of over 100,000. Reformist in politics, its editor Arthur Arnold employed writers such as William Black, the novelist, the clergyman H.R. Howis, barrister George Shee, and Frances Power Cobbe and George Byrom Curtis. The front page typically carried 2 unsigned leading articles, the first on politics and the second on broader social topics. Cobbe's leader, which appeared 3 times a week, was usually the second one. She was paid 2 guineas for each of these. As one of the handful of women to hold a staff position within a daily newspaper, she exerted substantial influence on public and parliamentary opinion during the 7 years in which she contributed these leading articles, and they range in topics from women's rights to animal cruelty. There was a change made in 1875, and it published larger but fewer pages and an unsuccessful morning edition, and Cobbe stepped aside when editors changed. There was a new editor in 1876. And then just after, she publishes Re-Echoes. Oh, I meant to have that on my thing. This is what the echo looked like. Re-Echoes, I think, is a really fascinating project, especially now that we have such a more detailed picture of the other things that she published in the periodical, but chose not to include. And these quotes are from the preface, where she's highlighting quite a few of the problems of us dealing with daily newspapers in the Curran Index, the kind of loss to periodical scholarship of not considering dailies, and how certain ideas of journalism get transmitted and certain things get left behind. So she opens with this example of an ice palace. The workmen who built and adorned Catherine of Russia's Palace of Ice must have experienced much the same sentiments as the contributor to a daily newspaper. Whether they hewed the solid crystal walls or carved the snowy statues and garlands of playful fancy, the same destiny they knew awaited them all. The sun of a few summer's days would melt them from memory. And a bit later, she says, readers may treat these slight scraps of literature like the contents of a painter's sketchbook, looking for nothing complete or finished, but only for a certain freshness belonging to the pencil's first depiction of a scene and to the pen's rapid discussion of a topic unthought of, perhaps, till the instant when the journalist sits down to his desk and the printer's boy waits in the anteroom of a copy. So I think this is a really interesting quotation to think of in terms of what we get from these new attributions that she selected in Re-Echoes, the things that she thought would last. She describes in her selection for the book that she chose these for revival chiefly because they partake more of the character of short essays on general subjects and are less exclusively comments on the news of the hour than the remainder of those which have been preserved. And of course, we know from the scrapbooks, she didn't preserve everything anyway. So it's a selection of a selection that is thinking about this question of ephemerality and what might be lost. But also, I like this reference to not looking for something complete or finished, which to me feels like a big ideological thing with the Curran Index, that I often say to people, it will outlive us all and the work will still be yet to be finished because there's so many directions it might go in and so many resources, such as the Times ledgers, that would take a sort of lifetime to get through. So daily newspapers present these kinds of problems, but they do offer something really interesting in these kind of incomplete, ephemeral, temporally bound, and sort of something that we need to recover, essentially. So Cobb is complicit in this skewed picture we get of her work for the Echo in publishing a small selection in Re-Echoes, and also because she leaves out more political work, what she calls the news of the hour. And we can see this in the titles. So I haven't got quite as far as I would like with the topic modelling of all of them, because when I set myself down to do this, knowing we had 91, I didn't quite realise we'd gone up to over 500. And I need to get them all through from the British Newspaper Archive in order to be able to do something. But even just looking at the titles that she chose for this book, the titles that we have of the other contributions that we now have that so vastly expand what we know that she did, we can see quite a difference in the kinds of topics that she wrote on that suggest what we might glean if we go and look in detail at these 500 pieces she wrote. So in the over 500 total that we have that she wrote for the Echo, the most frequent topic, most frequent two topics are death and questions of capital punishment, questions of sewage. She kind of uses questions of as a way to talk about a particular issue of the time. Gladstone comes up a lot as well, and murder, and she doesn't include the murder ones in Re-Echoes. They tend to be accounts of cases that are going on at the time. So we have this quite clearly newsy focus in the leaders that she's writing, which obviously makes sense, but is quite a different picture than what we get from Re-Echoes. In Re-Echoes, the list is almost entirely different. London is the most commonly written about topic. We also have family, church, and amusement as common topics. So what a journalist chooses to preserve and republish and kind of associate themselves with in book form is quite different, even at this kind of removed scale, in thinking about what Frances Power Cobbe is doing in the Echo versus what she does in Re-Echoes. And we can also compare this to the full Curran dataset for this period from 1868 to 1875. Among the most common words across our whole dataset are new, which is one of the most common in Frances Power Cobbe's ones as well, and life and history. And I wonder how that might compare to something like Wellesley, where the new and the discussion of what's happening, that ephemerality that comes through the sort of less prestigious periodicals that weren't included in Wellesley, speaks something to that ephemerality, even though we're talking about an incomplete picture when we're talking about the Curran Index. So I want to use my remaining few minutes to think about how we can compare and contextualize Frances Power Cobbe amongst the rest of the Curran Index, essentially, and how representative she is of what we have there and how much she's transformed what the Curran Index contains. So across all of our about 170, just 170,000, just over attributions that we have, the average age at publication is about 48 years old. That's the mean. The median is about 50. And this is amongst contributors that we have birth data for, which is not all of them. And I'm just talking about within this period of 1868 to 1875 when Cobbe was writing. So within the data set we have there, the percentage of women writing those articles is only 3.5% of the whole data set. So Frances Power Cobbe, in being such a prolific contributor, really adds to the picture that we have in the index. But there's interesting ways that she aligns slightly differently with what we have. She's part of a minority of women, fewer than 1 in 30 contributions across the data set were female. But mostly the age of women at publication in the Curran Index was a bit younger than Frances Power Cobbe was at this time. She aligns more with the men in this period in the index, being 46 years old in 1868. Where it's mostly women in their 30s or early 40s writing poetry, fictions, or reviews in this period in our other data. So she's somewhat unusual, both in being a woman and being so prolific, and obviously being a staff writer with a regular leader, and being a mid-career professional essayist, closer to a typical male contributor's age. So, as I said, my plan is to write an article on topic modelling of all of her leaders, but there are over 500, so it's the getting of the data is always the unglamorous part of these projects. But comparing to the text of the Echo allows us to see something about these questions of long-term value and what it means to be doing something like the Curran and reconstructing not the things people chose to preserve necessarily, but the things that don't get republished in those forms at those times. But it also adds so substantially to our knowledge of Cobb in ways that I wish I'd had more time at the beginning of the academic year to go away and actually look at how this really reshapes our picture of what she's written. But I'm very excited to go off and do that. But the legacy that we have just by looking in a sort of brief and distant way at these articles is quite different to what we get by looking at the other things that she's published, the few book length pieces that she put together, the essays, and especially the re-echoes. And I think that this is a really important example of the Curran Index broader mission, as Patrick Leary has put it, to bring writers out of the shadows. As I said at the beginning, Cobb is not exactly completely hidden from view, to use the shadow metaphor, but we're really getting just one side of her with the things that we have at the moment. And there's so much now from this bit of attribution work that Vic Clarke has done that could really transform how we understand her as a journalist and her role within the Echo and within the kind of political sphere. So, how attribution research can bring to light this shadow history of women journalists and in other places, poets who are left out of the Wellesley, and this kind of contribution to the periodical press really does aid in efforts to widen our understanding of what constitutes a 19th century canon, but also what constitutes 19th century journalism and authorship. So that's more or less. Oh, I forgot about this slide. I had a nice chart to show some of the things I was just talking about. That this is where Frances Power Cobbe falls in the age of publication within the 1868 to 1875 period, and where she falls. That she's kind of bang in the middle when you look at it together, but actually she's more aligned with the men than the women when we kind of disaggregate it in that way. So the final thing that I just wanted to say was again to say how much of a pleasure it's been to be involved with the Curran Index in this part of its long, hopefully very, very long life. And to remind people that we are open to contributions, but also that we have ways for you to do this kind of thing, to look at this kind of data, this kind of sociology of authorship, and give people access to more complex searches through the back end of the website. So I'm certainly going to be doing more with Frances Power Cobbe, but if any of this has made you interested to work with the data of the Curran Index, then please do get in touch. And I will stop there.
That's absolutely fantastic. Thank you so much for such a rich paper that opens up probably so many possible avenues of study. There's been some interesting comments in the chat as we've been going through, with a couple from Patrick. So I don't know if Patrick, would you like to lead with the questions?
Yeah, thank you. And thank you, Emily. What a wonderful talk. This is just such a rich subject, and it goes to show all the things that the Curran Index and you and Lars have done can bring to bear on our understanding of 19th century authorship. I mean, there's just so much to do, so much to work with. It's great. Plenitude has its problems, but also its delights, as you know. I just wanted to quickly make a point about how this came to us. I wanted to pick up on Emily's mention of Sally Mitchell. Mitchell's work is what is foundational to all this. And it was through going through her endnotes that I realized, oh, wait a minute, there are these scrapbooks out at Wales that she was working with. And she was doing a lot of this initial figuring out, with her own work with those scrapbooks, she was doing a sort of topic modeling of her own. She worked for many, many years on that great, big, beautiful biography of Cobb that she did. And that's when I went to Katie Birch and said, "Could you go have a look at these, see what they look like?" And she took a bunch of pictures, and before we knew it, we were in the middle of this project. But it raises a larger point, and that is that older scholarship is key to a lot of new advances that we can make in attribution work. I'm thinking about, even things as old as R.K. Webb's work with Harriet Martineau's leaders for the Daily News, which Ian Crawford's recently made a scans for us of now lost scrapbooks, basically, that show hundreds and hundreds. Once we get Martineau's leaders in, I think she may overtake Cobb as one of and she's already well represented in the index, but there's just a lot. So part of we need to be looking backward at a lot of work that unearthed a lot of these things before there was a Curran index, because there's just rich veins of ore there that these pioneers opened for us.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I think that's something that we've been trying to do this year is look back on key bits of scholarship because as we have talked about many times, lots of people are doing attribution work but don't think of themselves as doing it, in that it comes alongside if you find an author you're interested in and you read their works and you start to piece together what they've written, that's often the way that people are coming to this, which is partly why we've moved to a more author-friendly focus than we have before in recognition that that's often what people are doing. They're getting so familiar with someone's writing that they could do some of that slightly less high confidence, lower confidence attribution of saying they also wrote this on these topics. They were interested in this at this time, so this is likely contributed by them, and that people have been doing that for the past 100 years. So that kind of stuff, there's a lot that we can get from scholarship that's already out there. Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you. So I think we have another question from Tasia.
Yes, thank you. Firstly, just congratulations to the whole team. It's just such fantastic work. I'd heard about this from Patrick some time ago, and it's so fantastic to see this information here. And just fantastic work. I had a couple of questions. The first has to do with the daily news attributions, and it's a pretty straightforward question. I was wondering if any of her hitherto unknown foreign correspondence articles had been, like, did you come across those? Because I remember that being like I followed them through from Sally Mitchell's work, but it was, it sort of, at one point, I was just wondering what the scrapbooks might reveal. The second has to do with, I was wondering, Emily, about points where attribution gets a bit tricky, right? Like, it's so important what you were saying about those cases of maybe. And I'm reminded of an old essay that Sally Mitchell wrote in VPR, which has to do with misattribution of two articles by Frances Power Cobbe in the Wellesley Index. Because it was actually written by someone else called Fanny Power Cobbe, and who was,
Yeah.
and I think sort of Mitchell says that she might have been an illegitimate cousin, but we don't know, But so I was wondering about cases like this, and perhaps the scrapbook might help clarify some of those border cases. But I was also wondering, does it sometimes introduce more fuzziness into perhaps certainties that are better done away with, So I was just wondering about that.
Thank you very much. Yes. So we've got the two Cobbs in the Curran Index, the other one that things had been attributed to, and Frances Power Cobbe. And it's funny how these things come up and kind of reveal our assumptions and how sometimes we see what we're expecting to see. We had Troy Bassett sent us some lovely attributions for William Russell, and we first incorrectly put them in as William Howard Russell. That they're obviously very different people, and something more to do with where your mind is at when you see them than anything else. So yeah, there is this question of the kind of fuzziness and how you can record it, and I think how the Curran Index tries to give you the best picture it can give you at that time. So whether that means using the notes field and saying this is where we think we're at and being very clear about where the attribution has come from, so that we're not presenting a misleading picture that this is an absolute certainty, but that we're making space for leads that might help people. And I think that's also why we're so keen for people to contact us, because if we have a correction, we very much would like it, please. So yes, I think that fuzziness is also something that comes around the edges of the Curran Index sometimes of those kinds of cases where this is based on stuff that might change and the picture might change. And it's perhaps the benefit of having a live database over the Worsley Index books. It's easier to make those changes. And then on that international side, we do, I mean, I think it starts to show that in that we have a few things that she's contributed in Ireland. We have a few things that she's contributed to American periodicals, that there's a little bit of that sense. I know that Vic, there were some things that she couldn't check in the British Newspaper Archive and wants to go down to London so that we can confirm some things that we had from the scrapbooks that we don't have the proper attributions for. But yeah, I think that you can start to see those kinds of connections in the things that she's writing about and in those periodicals that are starting to be represented. But the bulk of it is the Standard and the Echo.
Ah, thanks.
Thanks, Emily. There's been an interesting sort of conversation that's been going on in the chat as well, about this sort of the power of collaborative attribution, really, sort of going back to some of that raw attribution data that Patrick was talking about, but also where people know that data may be that they might not be able to access. So Andrew Hobbs was asking about Martineau's short leaders for the Manchester Guardian. Patrick said they're not, but they are on index cards, so that's on the list and needs hunting down. And Katie's also said that if people do want any information or photographs from Cobb's scrapbooks, then they can contact her. So I think there's that network, as you've said, Emily. I just thought you might want to sort of expand on this a bit about how people can sort of come together to make these contributions.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's part of the changing shape of scholarship and partly in the changing status of the field of periodical studies, I suppose, where there are still people like yourself doing these wonderful, huge periodical studies, but a lot of people are not coming to it in that way. And so the kind of collaboration where somebody might go to index cards or to ledgers to look for something specific, but might also then have photos that go beyond that, is really powerful. And I think for us, I mean, it was a foundational aim for us to take the index, which both in terms of how the database was managed and in terms of how it was kind of run before us was a very individual approach. We wanted to make it more collaborative and open, but actually COVID really necessitated that we couldn't go places. So people on the ground in those places, it was partly from necessity and it was partly from that wider aim that we wanted to make things more collaborative. But it's been so fruitful and it's enabled the index to expand in a bunch of different directions at the same time. Again, I think in keeping with its aim of just trying to demystify as many of these attributions as possible. So collaboration has been incredibly valuable. And if anybody does want to collaborate on anything, I do encourage them to get in touch. It might be not, well, it won't be me from next year, but yes, I mean, I think that there are so many opportunities to collaborate on this that can enrich other people's projects as well as enriching the index.
That's great, thank you. And Alison has put the submissions link in the chat as well. So if people do have ideas about contributions or any ideas potentially about collaboration, then feel free to contact Emily and Lars up to December. And then we'll see who takes on the mantle thereafter. Any other questions or comments from people?
I think Laurel's got her hand.
Ah, right, okay. Thank you. Laurel?
Yes, I think that the situation of selecting out for specific audiences does show, which I think is a general thing with people selecting journalism for publication in their books. I found that certainly with Pater, and I mean, 50% of his work is not remediated. 50% of his work remains in the journalism. And for that, I mean, are fascinating, and they're both individual and social, right? And in terms of the audience that's aimed at, and and the identity he wants to build up, and so on. I mean, I think that does give us a tremendous insight into the breadth of journalism, and the different kind of audience, right? For daily journalism, monthly, weekly, and so on, from books.
Yeah.
from books. It's very, I mean, because I've always thought about that transfer, I mean, almost all of Peter's books are journalism, they're repackaged and remediated journalism. And that's really, as far as I went in a way, I mean, that he used journalism to work on his books, his book publications. But actually, it also shows us about the huge range and freedom that journalism offered authors. Right? I mean, it's a very, and of course income, which is related to that, which is related. I just think that so much of what you said about Cobbe is so richly suggestive for all of our investigations, into journalism.
Yeah, thank you very much. I mean, I think that thing about that actually doing something like this, it reveals so much about the newspaper, but also it tells us something about that environment of republishing in book form as well. That, as Patrick says in the comments, this kind of light reading of how that people get access to that kind of selection of the journalism, but then also what that author builds their name up as. That if they're publishing anonymous articles in a newspaper, that telling us more about the tone of that newspaper than it is about the author. And for the author, it's an opportunity to associate your name with, in the case of Cobbe, perhaps the more uncontroversial things, and have that be how people know and recognize you as your name, and then do something different with the journalism. So the ways that it can illuminate the author, the book publishing of journalism, but also the fact that the book publishing of journalism in a kind of recursive way is a major source of attribution for the Curran Index. So what we get when we get those pictures of those authors is the picture that they were establishing for themselves, the things that they would put their name to in some form or another. And then it becomes much harder to get those things that they are not putting their name to. So it's got such interesting implications for how we do attribution scholarship and how we understand these different parts of the market, that I think that Cobbe could be a really interesting case study of that.
I'll say two things.
Thanks, Emily.
I'll say two things. Peter published anonymously an article on Winkelmann in the Westminster Review, and then he published it in signature. He signed it in the Renaissance, and he kind of came out. I mean, it was a remarkable decision, right, to sign it and to publish it in the book. I mean, it was very interesting. And of course, he's working not to try and produce light literature, but to produce, a kind of high cultural, profile for himself. I mean, it's such a rich field, it seems to me, this question of the selection and what it means about, the sociology of journalism, and also a book publication and identity. And wonderful.
Thanks, Laurel. And Catherine Waters has added to that as well, talking about Sala's remediation of some of his reportage as well, but few, if any, of his leaders for the Daily Telegraph. Can I invite Martin to come in, who I believe has got his hand up?
Sorry. Finally my things work. It's really fascinating, Emily, and I think that last point about the way in which the published volumes kind of create this self-managed version, that is really, really interesting. But can I ask a kind of heretical question? Because as you know, we were talking about this, yesterday. I'm really taken by the quote that you used again from Eileen about her, one of her drivers in terms of setting the Curran Index up. These questions about the kind of sociology of authorship, if we want to call it that, and obviously, given the cultures of anonymity, particularly in the kind of Wellesley elite periodicals, it made sense to think that the sociology, those kinds of questions required attribution scholarship. But of course, as you've said, on a number of occasions, if we focus too much on attribution scholarship, we miss out on all the stuff that was attributed, and that is also part of the sociology of authorship. I just wondered, therefore, whether you feel the time has come to, break the shackles of attribution scholarship, as it were, and think about how we might build up our picture of the sociology of authorship and answer some of those questions that Eileen asks by developing data sets using periodicals where the authors did sign. And therefore, we've already got a kind of head start in terms of trying to place them and create those networks.
Thank you. Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question because we've been talking about this in terms of the limitations of the Curran Index in terms of if we say, 30% are women, this is not of everybody, this is unsigned things that are not in the Wellesley primarily, etc. But that there are so many kind of data sets available now, whether it's things like Troy Bassett's at the Circulating Library, whether it's trying to integrate things to do with the Wellesley that's now there is a digital form of it if somebody could convince them to share the data, that these things could come together. And I think the problem with the landscape is that things are all in different formats. Some things are behind paywalls, and getting everything together would be challenging. But I think it would be interesting to try and conceptualize what that kind of project would look like, what it would mean to bring these things together and see if you can put them on comparable and sort of on a footing that makes the most of what they're doing differently. That the Curran Index, it wasn't really, I guess at the beginning in terms of starting as corrections to the Wellesley, it's kind of morphed into this enormous data set that it wasn't always. And it owes a large amount of that to Punch and Athenaeum because they are sort of 60 and 80,000 attributions each of the 170 odd thousand that we have. What does it mean then to be working with this as kind of big data and how we can enrich that? But I mean, I think it's something I would like to think about at some point, maybe when I step down from the editorship and have a little bit more time, that what it would mean to bring these things together and to try and address some of those questions, because otherwise it feels like we're constantly deferring it of saying, when will we have enough data to address these questions? What can we actually do with the data we have now? So I'm afraid that's not really an answer to your question, but something that could be thought of. And Patrick's commented that he disagrees, that it won't be representative. So I think, Patrick, in response to that, that it's not trying to make it, including things like signed articles and abandoning the mission of the index, it wouldn't be to do that. It would be beyond the Curran Index to work with that data and put it into conversation with other data. So not trying to change the nature of the index, but what would it mean if we could do some kind of analysis with the data of the Wellesley and the data of the Curran Index together, kind of thing.
And I think that Alison's just put, it would be great to think about how digital tools could be developed for comparing some of these huge data sets on authorship, although she adds the addendum after a huge cleanup problem first. And I think that's maybe what you're saying, isn't it, Emily? That it's not to replace what Curran's doing, but to think about how Curran could work with some of those other resources and how if you start to cross-reference them, then that's potentially going to open up other avenues for sort of network and some of these topic frames that you were talking about before as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think we've got potentially time for one more question. If anyone has any. Emily, did you want to sort of add any sort of final thoughts?
Just on that point about bringing it into conversation, looking, for example, the Curran doesn't include the text of the articles. So one way of bringing what's in the Curran Index into conversation with other data sets is to build data sets of these articles. And I think with Frances Power Cobbe's leaders, that's what I want to do, because it's enough to do something interesting, but it's not 60,000 Athenaeum reviews. It's something that you can enrich the Curran without changing the nature of the Curran. It wouldn't be adding them to the index, but putting it into conversation with some of these other massive resources, which is something very much that Gary was setting out to do as well. So yes, I mean, I think there's so many exciting things for the future of the Curran, and I very much look forward to what the new editor or editors chooses to do with it. But I'm certainly not done with the data myself, and there are certainly things that I would like to do.
Absolutely. And I think some of the debates that have started in the comments would be really rich source. Emily and I were talking just as everyone was coming in, that there really is an opportunity to celebrate what Curran's achieved, potentially through a VPR special issue. We've also got the RSVP conference, which is coming up in Dublin next year. Closing date for CFP is November the 1st, so it'd be fantastic to have some papers maybe dealing with some of these methodology questions, but also some of the content questions. And then dovetailing in with RSVP next year, the BAVS conference is going to be in Liverpool, and we are doing that on the Monday, Tuesday and Wednesday following Dublin, so that hopefully some of our international speakers will be able to get 2 dissemination points for the price of 1 plane ticket. So CFP will be going live for that next week. Next Digi event, details are in the chat, which is how to get published in an academic journal, and that's going to be the 21st of November. But I think if you'll all join me in saying thank you so much to Emily, we've opened up a whole wonderful series of debates that we can follow up across other Digi events, maybe, definitely in VPR, and certainly at RSVP and BAVS next year. Thank you very much.
Thank you.